So if you remember last class, we were going through and making a grasshopper tool, which essentially can work with several different conditions. So we had the condition which will come up right here. So again, this file is in the Dropbox. So if you just go to the class files, and it'll be the class file from last class. We don't have any files for this class because this will serve as a basis. And if you remember, essentially we are making a grasshopper tool which allows us to sort of quickly generate buildings for several different roof typologies. So we have this kind of roof here which comes to a single point. We have this roof that comes to, I'll say, a central ridge. And then we have this roof which is an A-frame, I guess unidirectional roof. And we also have this kind of variation here, which is a kind of zigzag roof, which is a variation of this. So essentially what we're going to do is we are going to finish our tool. So we left off having finished this section of the definition, which creates this sort of single apex roof. So now we're going to focus on making this single ridge roof and this A-frame roof, which will be sort of covered by the same part of the definition. So what we're going to do is we're going to open Grasshopper. And I hope you have saved your work from last class. Remember, always save. We're going to sort of just jump back into where we left off at the end of last class. So just a quick review of what we did last class is we've started out by setting our parameters. So these are the inputs. So far the parameters we have our roof point or curve. And what that corresponds to is this either roof peak curve or a roof peak point. We were referring to a point last class, so since my definition is no longer referring to a point, I'll simply select my point right here, right-click that input parameter, and say set one geometry. We also have our input edge curves, and as a quick refresher, essentially that means the edges which are adjacent to a slope. So in the case of this kind of single vertex roof, the edges would be fourfold, so 1, 2, 3, 4 around the corners. So we can select these 4 curves and right-click input edge curves, set multiple curves. And finally, we have our roof mesh, which is essentially the messy mesh which we get out of Cloud Compare. So if some of you have sort of jumped forward a little bit in the video and looked at the process of exporting roofs from Cloud Compare, you will have seen how these meshes are created. And you will see that because of the LiDAR technology, there are hard limits in what LiDAR data can give you. So a few things that LiDAR data will give you in terms of artifacts is you'll either get no vertical surfaces, or if you've watched that video, we'll use something called SOR filtering. And that will get rid of some excess noise down here. But then also you still sometimes will get these jagged peaks on the vertical planes of a LiDAR scan, as well as if you look at the roof right there, even though that would actually be a maybe a functionally ineffective roof, but a very cool looking roof, this is probably not the actual condition of this roof. So what this definition is doing is cleaning these up automatically. And finally, we have our ground here, which is a surface. Now in the video, we ended up, as you watch through it, you'll find that you'll export your ground plane as a mesh and not a surface. We sort of briefly mentioned the difference between a mesh and a surface last class. So just a quick refresher, you can think of a mesh as a raster image. So it's defined by a certain amount of faces and vertices, whereas a surface, as you can see, is defined by these mathematical control points. So if I go to edit, control points on, you can see that this surface is defined by control points, some of which kind of exist outside the extents of the trim. So that is our ground plane, and essentially these are the pieces that we are going to be working with to finish our definition. So we finished last class by being able to generate this kind of house, but not this kind of house. So just to refresh, to differentiate between the two kinds of houses, we are essentially taking our roof peak point or curve, we're referencing it in a geometry parameter, and we're plugging it into a curve parameter. And what's happening here is that if this is not a curve going into this curve parameter right here, it's going to give us an error. So that's why it's red right now. So it says data conversion failed from point to curve. We have a point going into a curve component, so it gives us an error. We discussed how in Grasshopper, when you get an error, it's going to give you something called a null. So that's sort of it's not an empty space, but it's sort of a placeholder where an object is just not working. Because of that, we can test for whether or not an object is null using the component null item. And that in the null flags output will give us a true or a false. And we plug that into a stream gate to essentially say, okay, if we have a null, we are going to stream our input into stream 1, because true equals 1. If we have a false, aka is this curve not null, aka it is a curve, then we will stream into gate 0, because 0 equals false equals not null equals is a curve. One thing to point out here, and this is a super useful tip, some of you might have seen this in module 1, I'm not sure, but if you hold Control Alt and click on a component, it's going to pop up where you can find that component in Grasshopper. So if you're referring to this video and maybe you've saved some work, it's a component you've only used once, and you're not sure where it's located, there's two things you can do. You can always, of course, click on your canvas and just search for it. So stream gate. But if you want to know where it's located in the panels, you can hold Control Alt, get this little blue information icon, and click on an icon to see exactly where it is. So it's quite useful. So from there, I'll just talk about these definitions in kind of broad strokes. So the first thing we did, if we remember, is we took our edge curves and we essentially drew vertical rays down from these edge curves. So we divided the edge curves into points, so 10 points aside. We drew vertical rays down to find the intersections with the actual mesh. We used a call pattern based on this hit. So remember, call pattern essentially gets rid of items based on a pattern. This pattern is based on whether or not these points hit the edge of the roof. And from that, we drew vectors going down. So we drew vectors between these points that we can see right here. So all the points that intersected with the roof, we drew a vector straight down. Vector is just a direction and an amplitude. From there, we averaged those vectors to give us this average vector here, and this is what we move the edge curve down by. So this gives us our new edge curve that's actually on the base mesh. We also did the same for this little point on the roof, so we simply just found where this point here intersects with the roof. And then finally, we extruded the edges to the point. We joined them, the roof that is, and we extruded that roof shape down quite a bit. So we extruded it like 100 meters, or I guess 50 meters down. And we split that extrusion with the ground plane. And finally, using bounding boxes, so we used a bounding box above the top B-rep, the bottom B-rep from the split, found the centers of each box, we organized them, so sorted them by their Z component, aka their elevation, and we chose the one that had the higher elevation, always giving us the house above the ground. So that's kind of where we ended off last class, and as I mentioned, I just want to take maybe 20 minutes or so at the beginning of this course, or this class, to sort of do the other part of the definition. And if you've watched through the video, maybe I'll go to it right now for those of you who haven't. So tinyurl.com/SALA videos. If you go to this list, making sure volume's off,
it's going to take probably a couple
right
minutes to import because it's much bigger.
The area that we'll be covering
acceptable to do something like
much
that
larger
and say,
than this little section. So
is,
all these, it won't be this big, but you know,
like
if it's about this big, if you look at all
so now
the,
we see
houses,
this green
to model that, it
rectangle.
actually would.
We're going to click this little
for your future
red
projects,
polygon button, which says segment
this, or even
in.
messy data of any sort, Google
and
Map
now you can
data,
see what
instance,
it's done is it has clipped the data to that little rectangle and plan.
Houses.
And then
so that's
once you're happy with that,
so you can very
if you're not happy with your segmentation, you can click the little undo arrow to.
So since we've sort of defined the definition for this single point, we're just going to drag this down a little bit lower. And the reason why we're doing that is because since this is based on stream number 1, we're going to start working on stream number 0. So essentially, we're going to now work on this condition right here. So what we're going to do is we're going to re-reference our curve. So roof peak point or curve, I'm going to right-click this first input, and I'm going to say set one geometry. And that one geometry is going to be this line that defines the upper ridge of this roof, like that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define my input edge curves. So I'm going to right-click and say set multiple curves. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these edge curves. Now it doesn't really matter what order I'm selecting these in because we're sort of working with them individually. And I'm going to hit enter. So now let's see what's going on here. So we have the same ground and we still, our roof mesh is still valid because it's sort of a clump of these 6 houses. So we can sort of look at what's going on here now. So you'll first notice that our curve component right here, if not curve, then null is what I named it, is no longer null. So this means that this is now receiving a curve. You can see the output is no longer null, but is rather reference line like curve. And now when we test null item, you can see that the null flag is false. Because of that, our gate is set to 0, so false equals 0, true equals 1. And you can see that if we hover over our 1 gate, that 1 gate used to feed all of this stuff right here, right? So this used to feed our roof point intersection. It used to feed our roof extrusion and ground split, all this kind of stuff. But now since there's nothing coming out of 1, it's not doing this anymore. And using these kind of gates is useful in Grasshopper because maybe you've already encountered it, you for sure will encounter it. Sometimes Grasshopper gets very slow when there's too much stuff going on at once. So this nice logical gate really limits us to working with what we actually want to work with at the time. So if we look at stream gate 0 now, you can see that our reference line like curve, our roof apex here, actually comes through. So now we're going to sort of start working out of stream gate 0 instead of stream gate 1. And I am just going to refer to my notes. Okay. So essentially what we're going to do is we are going to take this central roof edge, and we're gonna move it down. Now remember, since it's no longer a point, but rather it's an edge, we can't just find a single intersection point. We want to find an average of this roof edge as it intersects with this roof down here. So can someone think of a very practical way to make use of the work we've already done and sort of repurpose it for this central roof edge? So essentially, if you think about what we've done here, if you were thinking about how we divided these edge curves before, we drew a vector straight down and then found the intersection between the edges and the mesh here. Essentially, we can do the same thing with the central ridge of the roof. So what we can do is we can just go down to this group we've made right here. So I've labeled it as moving down edge curves. I've labeled it as moving down edge curves, but we know what that means. And essentially, what I can do is I can select the components starting from input edge curves all the way to my move. And I can just select these now, and I can go Control C, Control V, copy them up, and now I can actually just put my stream gate 0 straight into the input edge curve and look at what comes out the other side, and you can see I have an average curve. So we've already done this work, so we might as well reuse it. So I think what I'll do for this, since I know not everyone's work is exactly the same, I will actually save this file as it stands right now in the Dropbox. So please feel free to refer to this and start working from this. But essentially, again, all we did was we copied this section here. So the moving down edge curves section, we just copied it straight up. So we started from the input curves and we ended with the movement vector.
But you disconnected everything first?
I didn't disconnect first, so I'll sort of redo that again. So essentially what I did was I just selected. You can see that all this stuff is still connected. I just went Control C, Control V, and you can see it's still connected, right? So these input curves are still connected, but then I just replaced our input. So this is connected to our set edge curves, but if I instead just drag the stream 0 output into my input edge curves, then it automatically updates. So like so. So I'm going to save this in the Dropbox. If you want a refresher on how this actual definition we just copied was made, I did post Monday's class to the YouTube channel, so you can just refer to that and sort of review that. You can review that class or this class during work time even. So, and if you have any more questions about that, feel free to ask me. So I'll just save that in today's class. Okay. All right, so now what we have is we have this central roof ridge. And what we want to do is we want to extrude our edge curves, so I can essentially move down this other stuff here. So essentially what we're doing is we're just sort of separating the things we'll use for this version of the definition from the things we used from the point version of the definition. So what I have here now is just these two sort of average edge condition definitions. So if I preview on my curves out, my geometry move out, you can see what I should end up with is these roof edges and this central edge right there. So again, I'll actually save where I am right now, just so we're all on the same page. So we have these two components here coming out, which is the roof top, roof edges. So if we think about how we are going to, and also I'm going to hide my mesh right there so we can see this a little bit better. If you can remember what we did last time is we lofted the edges to a point, right? So we can kind of think about doing the same thing here. So we can loft the edges to this line. Can anyone think of why that doesn't really work in this case? Why doesn't it work to loft the edges to this central line? I'll show you. So there's technical errors and there's logical errors, right? So a technical error is when something gives you a red component in Grasshopper and it literally technically does not work. But there's logical errors in that what you want it to do isn't what Grasshopper does. So for example, if I were to go to surface freeform loft, and I were to put in my central curve right there and all my other curves, we'd get this kind of crazy thing, right? So what this is doing right now is it's lofting between all the curves. But think about it, even if I sort of separated out all these edge curves, so what I could do instead, and don't worry about following along with this, is I could graft the output of these edge curves and I could try lofting them all to this central curve. And yeah, it's not even letting me do it, but essentially you can imagine what happens is this curve would loft nicely to this curve because they're running parallel. This edge curve would loft nicely to this roof ridge curve because they're running parallel. But if we try to loft these curves, which are running perpendicular to this roof ridge, you can imagine they're going to twist as they move up. So it's not going to give us what we want. What we want to do is we want to loft this edge curve to an endpoint, this edge curve to an endpoint, and we want to loft this, this edge curve to this curve, this edge curve to this curve. So can anyone think of a non-Grasshopper way, but just sort of explaining in plain English how you can differentiate between which edge curves you want to loft to the entire roof curve and which edge points, or yeah, which edge lines you want to loft to the roof ridge end points. So loft to a point versus loft to a line. How can we distinguish between those two edge conditions? Here, let me. So we have our central edge there. We have our edge curves. And what we want to do is we want to loft to the end points like so. So make a triangle on the ends. And these side ones, we want to loft between these two lines to create this polygon with 4 sides. So can anyone think about what this line has in common with this line and maybe what this line does not have in common with this line?
X or Y factor.
Sorry?
The X or Y on which it sits.
Yeah, so essentially, I think what you're saying is that we can even explain it more simply. These two lines are roughly parallel, right? And this line is roughly perpendicular. So this goes this way, this goes this way. So we could differentiate like that. Another way we could differentiate is we could look at the endpoints of this line. So we could say, okay, look at the endpoint of this edge, find the closest point from these endpoints on this central line, right? They would both find the same point. And if that's the case, if they both find the same point, then we'd say, okay, just draw a triangle like that. Whereas this one, if you try to find the endpoint here, in here, and say find the closest point on this curve, then it would just draw that shape, right? So that's another way we could do it. So there's a bunch of ways you can do it. I'm going to do it the endpoint way, just because it's probably a little bit simpler. But this is essentially just what we're trying to suss out. So when I'm asking these questions, it's not like, hey, have you studied grasshopper? It's literally, how can we think about this in a plain English way to sort of work through the problem? And once you figure out the problem, then figuring out how to do it in grasshopper is actually a little bit easier. So what we can do then, we have our edge lines right here. We can find the endpoints of those edge curves. So we can go to curve, analysis, endpoints. So curve, analysis, endpoints. The other thing we can do is we can find the, we can just leave that for now. But what we want to do is we want to find the closest point from these endpoints to the closest point on this central ridge. And we want to do that for each roof edge by itself. So can anyone think about what I can do to right-click the curve input there? Should I go reverse, flatten, graft, or simplify in order to look at these roof edges in isolation, so in their own little box? No? It is graft. So grafting, what it does, remember, if we don't graft this, if we look at this, you can see it says 4 values inherited from one source. Line like curve, line like curve, line like curve, line like curve. What this means is these are all in one list. So they're all going to be considered at the same time. If we right click and then go graft and then look at the input, you can see it says 4 values inherited from one source, and we essentially get 4 addresses, right? So we have one path, which is 0, 0, one that's 0, 1, 1, 0, 2, 1, 0, 3. And if you look at the information parentheses following those paths, you can see n equals 1. So that means 1 item per list, or essentially we're looking at the edges in isolation. Out of reverse, flatten, graft, or simplify, which of these inputs would we use to get rid of these extra zeros? So we see that there's zeros leading all these paths, so this first 0 is kind of superfluous. So how do we simplify these paths? I'll give you a hint, it's not reverse. We simplify them, yes. So now we just have paths that are 0, 1, 2, 3. So that's easier to work with. And now we can simply take the start points of each of these curves, and we can find the closest point on this line. So we can go to curve, analysis, closest point. So curve, analysis, curve, closest point. We can plug our start output into our point input, and our geometry output into our curve input. So you can see what that's doing is it's finding points on the end there, and that's kind of what we want. The next thing we can do is just go to curve, analysis, curve, closest point. And we can do the same with the endpoint. So we'll plug the endpoint output into the point input and the geometry output into the curve input. And again, you can see that we're finding the closest points there. That's sort of to be expected. And then what we can do though, is we can now just draw surfaces with these points. So we can go to surface, freeform, 4-point surface. So surface, freeform, 4-point surface. Now, if we think about the order we want to put these points in, essentially it should be fairly easy, but you can think about if this is the start point right here, we can put that in first. We can start from this start point. So take your endpoints component, take the start output, put it into corner A. And then if we think about what point we want to do next, we probably want to go, let's say, clockwise. So start point's going to be here. It's actually easier to see it on this one. So start point will be here. The next point we want to put into our surface is this one here. So that's the surface or the curve closest point closest to start. So that's the top curve closest point. So it's the curve closest point coming out of the start. So let's take the output from point and put into corner B. The next one we want to do, if we're going clockwise, is 1, 2, 3. This is the curve closest point coming out of the end, because this is the end here. So we see the end output going into the point input. So this point output is our corner C. You can see that it's starting to make a triangle like so. And then finally, we can take our end point and put into corner D. And now you can see we get this roof. So does anyone have any questions about that? If you do have some questions and you're still trying to suss through it right now, again, during, yeah.
So this formula is plugging in each corner. Is there other ways that it would work, or is this only
What do you mean by other ways?
Like, can you reverse it? Like, corner A would be the closest point, which is corner B plus the end point?
Yeah, so essentially you can reverse the order, but you just want to make sure that they're either going clockwise or counterclockwise. If you were to, let's say, do, let's say this is 0.0, this is 0.1, this is 0.2, this is 0.3, then you'd get a weird surface that's all mixed up. So for instance, if we plug that there, you can see we're getting this kind of wind sail shark fin kind of surface. So if we all more or less have this roof here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to join all these surfaces. So if we look at the data output coming out of this, we can see we have 4 lists. Why might we not be able to join these surfaces together right now as this data is organized? So we won't be able to join this because they're grafted. So remember, grafted, you look at the output, you see 4 paths. So that's the 0, 1, 2, 3. N equals 1. That means there's 1 item in each path. So these 4 roofs are sort of being looked at in their own little silos, their own little worlds. In order to join them, first we will need to do something. So we'll need to right-click the surface output, and we'll need to do flatten. So flatten all data in this parameter into a single list. And now when we look at the output, we have our 4 untrimmed surfaces in one list. So the next step is going to work for us. So what we can do now is we can go to Surface, Utilities, brep join. And we can plug our flattened surface output into the breps, like so. And now we have this as one open brep, so this roof shape. Now, what I'm going to do is, since we've reached a pretty good point here where it's like, okay, we have our roof, we've defined this, these 4 planes. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to select all these components we've worked on so far in this class, and I'm going to right-click outside of them and go Group. And then I'm going to right-click this group, and I am going to call it Roof Surfaces. Like so. Now, what we're going to do now is we're just going to extrude this surface down. We're going to essentially split it with this ground surface. Then we are going to create a bounding box between the top half of the split and the bottom half of the split. We're going to organize those bounding boxes by their elevation point, and we are going to synchronously sort the split B reps by those same elevations and choose the higher one. So can anyone think of what day of the week we did that? I'll give you a hint, it starts with M. Monday, thank you. So yes, we did exactly that on Monday. So if you remember, we have our roof extrusion and ground split that extruded our joined roof here, and then we split it with the ground plane and selected the upper B rep. So what we can do now, and this is kind of the nice modular nature of Grasshopper, is we've already done this, and this is another reason why I like grouping things. Do as I say, not as I do. I didn't group this last thing, so I'll group it now. But we can just copy these two last groups up to our work today, and they will give us the same results. So let's grab the roof extrusion and ground split group, and this final group, which essentially organizes. So I'll label this group right now. I'll just call it organizing B reps by elevation and getting top one. I can just copy these two groups. So again, Control C, Control V, and drag them up to my current definition. So you can see that the input for this is right at the beginning. Now, there's a few things in here that I don't need anymore. So if I look at what this extrude point does, that was the part of the component that extruded the edge curves to this central point. So I don't have a base shape I want to extrude anymore to a point. I don't have a point anymore, so I can just delete this. Likewise, the next thing in this group is the B rep join. This is what we've just done right here. We've already joined these B reps, so we can delete this extra B rep joins. So now that I've done that, I can simply plug my joined roof B reps into the extrude base input that's in this roof extrusion and ground split input. So you can see there is my automatic house. So it just sort of pops out. Now, what I'm gonna do is, so this is kind of a tool, and I will actually save this in Dropbox, this entire finished thing, because I want you all to be able to use it. And if you're still trying to figure out certain parts of how it works, please send me an email, refer back to the videos, but I don't want someone to get caught up on this and sort of fall behind in the next parts. But this is sort of just an example of how Grasshopper could be used as a tool. So I'm going to save it now, and I'm going to sort of show you how flexible this tool is. The one last thing I want to do here is we have our two final outputs, right? So we have the output from our, we can call it single ridge roof house. So that's the list item at the end of this definition. And then we also have the single list item output from our extrude to a point definition. What I like to do sometimes if I have sort of a tool-like definition like this is I like grouping the output and putting it back towards the beginning so I can fastly iterate through inputs. And I'll show you what I mean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to params, I'll go to primitive, and I will go to, or I won't do that, I'll go params, geometry, geometry. So params, geometry, geometry. I will plug my list item into geometry, like so. So now I have my house turning green. And I will hold shift so I see the tiny green arrow with an addition sign, and I will plug it into that geometry component as well. And it doesn't matter if it's orange right now, that just means that there's nothing going into there. And I will right click this geometry component and I'll call it something subtle like bake me. And this essentially is the endpoint for your definition, regardless of whether you're extruding to a point or extruding to a central ridge now. So further to that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to preview off all this other stuff in here so that we only kind of see the end product. I'm going to preview off all of this stuff in here. So just make sure it's all previewed off. And I am going to preview off a few of these inputs. So I'm going to preview off, let's say the ground, because we don't really need to see that. We know what the ground is. And I won't preview off any of these other things. It's probably useful to see what we're actually selecting. But what I will do is I'll drag this bake me output and drag it right up to the front like that. And the reason why we can do this is now we have our inputs here and our output here. So what we can do is we can quickly move between them. So what I mean is we have this house here, we want to bake it. I can right click it, click bake, and bake it onto the buildings layer, click OK. Okay, now I want to bake this house. So I can select the edge curves and go set multiple curves. You can see it's updating, but it's updating in a weird way. So I can select this point and go roof peak or point curve, go set one geometry. Now you can see it's updated. So again, I can just right click bake me, go to bake, go to buildings, A-OK. What's more is I could always, let's select these edge curves again, right click input edge curves, go to set multiple curves, select the central curve, go to roof peak point or curve, right click that, set one geometry. You can see we have that house, but now what we can do is we can just simply drag these curves to other houses. And for your assignment building your site model, this is going to be very useful because now you can just do something like this. You can go, okay, here's this house. You can see that it's automatically going up to approximately the right height. So you'd bake that, you'd move it to the next house, bake that, move it to the next house. Now, one thing about this tool I'll show you, and the flexibility, if you sort of want, if you aren't quite sure understand how it's flexible like this, that's okay. You can ask me and we can sort of talk about it, but essentially the other thing you can do with this is we have this third edge condition, right? Where we have a roof that's just a standard A-frame. It's not tilting towards the central ridge. So if you have a condition right like that, all you need to do is get rid of your other edges because they won't be sloping up. You can see now that the house is making this weird bow tie shape. And you simply just need to make your central ridge the same length as your end ridges. And you can see that it will create the right style of house for you. So if you have this kind of house, then you just need edge curves like this.
Could you maybe go over just once again how you duplicated the house? Well, after you drew the
Sure.
the outward bake me all the way over.
Sure. So I'm going to go to wire display hidden here so that the bake me inputs in because that weird curve felt weird. So essentially, maybe I'll just go Control Z in here. Essentially, I'll just go through the three conditions. So the way this definition works is it extrudes edges to either a point and a curve. So for a kind of central point roof like so, it's extruding to a point, and all four edges are extruding to that point. So what you need to do in your input edge curve is you need to set all four edges in a point. For a condition like so, where we have this central ridge, but all four edges are going to this central ridge, you want to draw all four edges. So 1, 2, 3, 4, they're all going to the central edge. That's why we draw that. If we have a A-frame condition, you just have to think about what edges are actually sloping up. So in an A-frame condition, only this edge are sloping to the central edge. So that's why we draw this edge, and then our central edge. So that's the difference between those three. If you imagine this kind of building here that slopes up first, the way you could draw this building using this definition, so I've already pre-drawn in these curves, is you could select the high curve. So that's a high peak right there. You could select it and go roof peak point or curve. You could right click that and go set one geometry. Here's the low edge, so you could select that low edge. You would right click input edge curves and go set one curve. The mesh is not updated. You see we're still referencing this mesh, so that's why it's not updated. So let's select this mesh, right click roof mesh, go to set one mesh, and now you can see we have that geometry there. So we would bake it. So bake it under buildings. And now we have this simple A-frame condition, so we could set that. We could go roof peak pointer curve, set one geometry. That would be this curve right there. And this edge would be the edge curve. So we'd go input edge curves, right click, set multiple curves, and we would set that one and that one. Now we have this A-frame, so we'd right click bake me and go bake under buildings. So that's kind of the idea behind this, because again, as I showed in the video and some of you have seen, for your actual site model, you'll probably have like 5 to 10 times as many buildings as we have here. And you'd be surprised at how modeling these buildings can get very repetitive. The other thing worth noting is that for this tool we've made, you can also rotate the curves. So for example, this house is slightly off angle. Feel free to rotate those edge curves and you'll